that's all the same. It's not. It's not the same, because if you're a raccoon or a skunk or an opossum that needs some kind of cover to feel comfortable transversing a large area, you're not going to be able to do that, right? Maybe you're going to move onto the streets and actually use underneath the cars as your cover. And that puts you in danger as well. So these parks are not created equal. So the parks are designed specifically in parts of the city so that police can have a sight line across the park. And again, this is racial politics that are influencing wildlife.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Yadrick, and we are recording from Puyallup Territory, also known as Grit City, Tacoma, at the south end of the Salish Sea. It's been a minute, and I've been in motion, literally. I'm coming to you from a new home and a new chapter in both my personal and professional life. I'm not exactly surrounded by boxes, but my son, the dogs, and I are still settling in. After nearly a decade of living in one part of Tacoma, I recently packed up, moved house, and planted myself in new soil, literally and figuratively. It's been a season of sorting, uprooting, dreaming, and regrounding. If you've ever made a move like that, whether across town or across life, you know it's not just about the boxes and address changes, it's about making space for something new to take root. And something new is taking root. I've officially launched Madrone Grove Adaptation and Restoration, a name, a business that speaks to the tenacity and crooked beauty of Pacific madrone trees and to the kind of restoration work I want to be doing. This is a small, intentionally scrappy consulting practice rooted in love for place. Think of it as a seedling with 3 intertwined branches: community-driven ecological restoration, small forest landowner consulting, as well as climate adaptation. And I left some room in the business plan for mixing up botanical potions from plants. I'm trying to build a practice that's place-based, all my own, as well as deeply collaborative. So if you have a small to medium-sized restoration you want to connect on, please find my contact info in the show notes. But today we're going on an entirely different kind of city-to-forest journey, one led by someone whose work I've admired for a while. We recorded before my house move, so I'm grateful for their extreme patience producing this conversation for Tree Hugger listeners. We're digging into how evolution plays out in the most unlikely places: alleyways, borderlands, bus stops, and how those spaces are shaped not just by roads or runoff, but by war, politics, and religion. I had the privilege of talking with Dr. Liz Carlen, an evolutionary biologist and science communicator who is shaping how we think about life in cities. Liz is a postdoctoral fellow at the Living Earth Collaborative at Washington University in St. Louis. And you might have seen her writing in Scientific American, The Conversation, or her Pigeons of New York research that has made the rounds. But this conversation was about something even bigger, a recent Nature Cities article co-authored by Liz and others titled Legacy Effects of Religion, Politics, and War on Urban Evolutionary Biology. What does that mean? Liz and her co-authors offer 11 testable hypotheses to explore how religion, politics, and war don't just change culture or cities, they change evolutionary trajectories. And one of my favorite parts, they call for better integration of social sciences and even humanities into evolutionary biology. But if you're going to study life in cities, you can't ignore power, grief, memory, and hope. It means evolution isn't just some slow Darwinian drift happening in ancient forests or remote islands. It's happening now, in the shadow of mosques and monasteries, along contested borders, and in neighborhoods shaped by redlining and reconstruction. Cities are not ecologically neutral. Evolution moves fast in the metropolis when species are under pressure. During our conversation, Liz breaks down how religious practices can act as informal conservation tools, like when sacred groves protect native biodiversity or border walls fragment wildlife populations. We talk about the ways militarized borders split up habitat and isolate populations, and how war, both civil and global, leaves evolutionary scars on both people and pigeons. Now, this wasn't a stiff academic interview. Liz is sharp, funny, and deeply committed to weaving justice into her science. We talked about the squirrels of St. Louis, the problem with treating cities as ecological noise, and the importance of interdisciplinary and intercultural collaboration. So if you're curious about how urban life evolves, not just in the biology lab, but in the cracks of concrete and under systems of power, this one's for you. Let's get into it.
I'm Elizabeth Carlen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Living Earth Collaborative at Washington University in St. Louis. And broadly, I'm an urban evolutionary ecologist. I'm really interested in how cities are shaping wildlife. And I started on this path because I thought I wanted to live in the middle of nowhere. And I tried that in East Texas, and it turns out that I do not like living in the middle of nowhere, that I want to be able to walk to my grocery store and my coffee shop and know the people in my neighborhood. And so I started going back to thinking about cities and had always really been fascinated with wildlife in cities, having grown up in the Bay Area. And ended up kind of focusing on these questions of cities were supposed to be so inhospitable to wildlife. That's what I was taught in my biology classes. But I saw that that was not true, that there was actually wildlife surviving and even thriving in cities. And so I wanted to understand why and how do we better build cities to ensure that this wildlife does well.
Lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I saw that you just published this paper, this review article called Legacy Effects of Religion, Politics, and War on Urban Evolutionary Biology. It's a mouthful. I think it's super cool. There's a bunch of co-authors. Almost everybody I don't recognize. I don't know if you want to give them a shout out, but it sounds like this paper, this idea anyway, has been living rent free in your mind for a while.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about cities for a long time. And for a while, we were thinking that cities are these beautiful replicates of each other all over the world. And so we can do these urban evolution experiments and hopefully in these different cities, hopefully get parallel results. And we've started doing that. We're getting very different results. But part of that is because cities are not these beautiful replicates of each other. I can't remember the name of the congressperson that said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And I feel like that is the same with cities. I can't quite describe to you what a city is. Is it impervious surface? Is it population density? Is it self-governance? Is it arts and culture? It's hard to describe, but I know cities when I see them, and I know how cities are different than rural environments, even if I can't quite put that into complete words. And cities are in part or hugely shaped by humans, right? And humans come with their own culture. And part of that culture is religion, politics, and war, which have really not been discussed in the literature of urban evolution. And when I'm talking about evolution here, it's really biological evolution, this idea that alleles in a population change over time. And we hadn't really thought about how these cultural impacts of religion, politics, and war are shaping cities, even though we know that they have huge influence on cities themselves.
From what I know about you is that you've studied like really in depth eastern gray squirrels and then pigeons and how these species differentiate across different urban ecosystems across like mega cities. I think you just defined evolutionary biology, but I guess who cares about this or what or how or why should we care?
Besides myself having become very fond of pigeons and very fond of squirrels, for a lot of people, this is the only wildlife that they're really going to interact with on a daily basis. It might be the only wildlife that they see, depending on where they are. They're also super recognizable. I did my master's on giant elephant shrews, which are in sub-Saharan Africa. They're wild animals. They're about the size of a large rabbit, and they have a long snout and really long, thick legs and very slender opossum-like tail. But who has seen those? Most people have not seen those, and they're not interacting with them on a daily basis. It's also become really important to me to do work where I live, that I want to not be a parachute scientist. I don't want to go into an area and study it if I am not civically invested in that area. And so I moved to St. Louis. I am paying taxes in St. Louis. I'm voting in St. Louis. I am impacting the environment around me with my political choices. And I feel like that is the right thing to be doing. And it was the same when I was studying pigeons. Granted, I couldn't live across the entire northeastern megacity, but I looked at pigeons from Boston down to Washington, D.C., and was living in New York City at the time. And what I'm really interested in is population genetics. So, this idea of populations differentiate over space and over time. And what I like to say is I'm the 23andMe of wildlife biology. And so in the same way that 23andMe can tell you if you have Scottish ancestry versus English ancestry, right? They're on the same island, they're not that far removed from each other. I am looking at that in pigeons. I'm looking at that in squirrels. I'm really trying to figure out what's the big family tree and how are these all related to each other within a given space.
That's a great metaphor. Honestly, yeah, the 23, I don't know what percentage of listeners have done 23andMe, but I'm imagining like my ancestral map and everything.
But we loved getting that information about
Yeah,
ourselves, right? We
yeah.
wanted to know I'm this percentage Italian, I'm this percentage
Hmm.
Irish, I'm this percentage Neanderthal. We like that information.
Yeah.
So, like, how can we trace that back?
I did lie. I'm looking at this co-authors on this paper. John Marsliff was a former guest on the show. He lives like north of me, maybe 60 miles. And then Christopher Schell, too. I think your niche aligns with Christopher Schell, and he's formerly at University of Washington here, close to me. And so I was familiar about some of the work that he published a while back about the evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environments. And then this great paper, too, about recreating Wakanda by promoting Black excellence in ecology and evolution, too. And then I see that your pick is on his lab's website as well. So I don't know if you
Yeah,
all organized together, but I want to
yeah.
give shout outs to those two folks because I love them.
This paper is actually inspired by Chris's 2020 science paper about the systemic impacts of racism on evolutionary biology. And the senior author on this paper, Marta, read Chris's paper and was super intrigued by it. And Marta is based in Poland. And so she started thinking about what are these other things that are influencing wildlife in different regimes, right? So Poland is very interesting. I was lucky enough to visit her there last year, and we went to neighborhoods that were built under communism. And then we went to neighborhoods that were built under capitalism, and they look very different. And part of that's because under communism, there were no fences. There's no private land. And everything is public and the giant block buildings like Soviet block housing, but it all looks out on these common garden areas and there's lots of green space and no parking spaces. People didn't have cars. People walked. People used the metro. And then when we go to these spaces that were built under capitalism, it's that common 4/1, where it's 4 levels of residential housing over a level of commercial and lots of places to park because everybody's using a car to get to that area. And so it was just interesting to think about here's how the political regime of these two areas is impacting wildlife because how are wildlife moving through this green space that's there and the impact of cars, which are obviously can be lethal to wildlife.
Yes, I think, yeah, what you're starting to talk about is, I think traditionally evolutionary biology has talked about like fragmentation, right, of the urban landscape. And so that's been studied forever or for the whole history of evolutionary biology, wherever it originated. And these different types of, for lack of a better term, urban planning or lack of planning, how it
Mm-hmm.
affects different individuals, even us humans. I think the other urban animals that I see in my town are like coyotes, deer, possums and squirrels, so like the little mammals,
Raccoons,
yeah, yeah, that live on the edges of human populations
right?
or in our communities.
Skunks. Does that smell like weed or is that a skunk? Which one
Yeah,
is it?
yeah. Honestly, I recalled in this Grit City carnivore project, the biologists were like so ecstatic because they're like, skunks are good habitat quality. And I was like, great. And we saw like the tail of one kind of dip out the other day too. So we were like celebrated.
Some of us weird biologists get
Hmm.
really into seeing
Yeah.
these animals.
So what I understand is that you study the kind of how segregated cities like St. Louis, like we're talking about, how it can differentiate. You can see like wildlife in one part of town and you don't see them in other parts of town, or there's different urban processes, or just phenomena like religion, politics, and war across different places, how it affects how we live and how we evolve. And when I say we, it's like the more than human.
So evolution occurs at the population level. And in reality, evolution is occurring broadly across the population. It doesn't happen to one individual. In places like St. Louis, one of the impacts of racial politics has been that the parks look very different in the white neighborhoods versus the black neighborhoods. St. Louis is divided across a single road called the Delmar Divide. It's Delmar Boulevard. And it was nicknamed the Delmar Divide because the population north of Delmar is predominantly black, and the population south of Delmar is predominantly white. And there's massive differences in things like education and annual income and home value across this divide as well, that are all remnants of segregation and racial policies. But within these areas, the parks are managed very differently. And so I live right next to the big park in St. Louis called Forest Park, which was where the World's Fair was in 1904. It's a beautiful park and it's in the white neighborhood. And it has two golf courses. It has 18 tennis courts. It has handball courts. It has an ice skating rink that doubles as a roller rink during the summer. It has baseball fields. It has soccer fields. It had all these things to benefit the people. Up until last year, it had zero basketball courts because they did not want people coming in. And even when the basketball courts were put in, there was discussion about if they should be gated off. And of course, they put the basketball courts on the north side of the park so that people wouldn't travel through. And we've still only got a handful of basketball courts in that park. But then, as I was mentioning, this green space looks very different. There's areas of the park that have been restored, and the creek that kind of runs through there has been placed back above ground. I've seen a muskrat, deer, snapping turtles, lots of really interesting wildlife hanging out in this area. There's lots of low bushes and low trees, and then there's some open grassy areas. But when you go to parks in the northern part of the city, they're basically fields with really tall trees in them, and that's it. And if you're wildlife, yeah, that's all green space. And when we're looking and thinking about, oh, canopy cover, it's not. It's not the same because if you're a raccoon or a skunk or an opossum that needs some kind of cover to feel comfortable traversing a large area, you're not going to be able to do that, right? Maybe you're going to move onto the streets and actually use underneath the cars as your cover. And that puts you in danger as well. So these parks are not created equal. And this difference is called crime prevention through environmental design. So the parks are designed specifically in parts of the city so that police can have a sight line across the park.
Wow, we've never talked about septed on this podcast, but yeah, some of the concepts that I know about it, and I have interacted with the cops because I used to be a parks employee. I used to be a parks guy for a bunch of years, and yeah, it's basically no one, cops don't want to get out of their cars, so they're able to drive by and be able to see through things, and there's a certain amount of territoriality with the turf. This looks like legitimate turf and activities happen here.
Mhm.
And so like people living and housed in parks is not really legitimate, not allowed in most places. And then surveillance as well comes along with surveillance. So being able to like see through things. So sometimes like a common forest ecosystem around here would be super brushy, under like lush understory, and a lot of that is often removed in these like more kind of landscape parks, we call them.
And it was shocking. I hadn't heard that term before moving to St. Louis, and it was only through noticing how extremely different these parks were that I went and started just Googling, why do parks look different? What does it mean when there's no bushes in a park? And I finally came across this whole body of work. And it was quite shocking to me that those racist and political actions are influencing what wildlife can and cannot be in those areas.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And this touches on other disciplines like political ecology or critical ecology that is,
Yeah.
I see more and more, which like I'm fond of really. So it is really interesting. And I think you've touched a lot on maybe the politics, but if we get a chance, I'd like to talk about how religion also plays a part because I think we think of religious structures or some cemeteries as like sanctuaries perhaps for wildlife, but also it can, I don't know, looking back in the history of people battling over religion, it's probably helped steer migrations quite a bit.
Yeah. So, side note, my house that I grew up in backed onto a cemetery.
Hmm.
And so I played in the cemetery a lot as a kid because we didn't have sidewalks in my neighborhood. And the cemetery was the safest place to play. And I realize now that is really weird. And not everybody took their guinea pigs for walks in the cemetery, but I did. And we had tons of wildlife back there. We had coyotes, we had raccoons, we had opossums, we had turkeys, we had deer, we had skunks. And I think that idea of these cemeteries as green spaces is really fascinating. It's also really interesting that we also feel like we need to have a place to honor our dead, that we're using up large swaths of land, and it can potentially be great for wildlife. It depends on how it's managed. Many cemeteries are managed so that they're just pristine green lawns with either tall headstones or kind of flat headstones. And so it just looks like a big plain of grass, and that can have impacts on the wildlife. Within religions, there are some people that believe that as humans, we're put on this earth by God, and God gave us this earth as a resource to be able to use. And there are other people within that same religion that think that earth is something that we should care for. And so even within Christianity, there are different ideas about how the earth should be, how we should steward this place that we live in. Do we take all the resources? Do we honor those resources? And so religion has had this really interesting impact on how we're interacting with the environment. We view our religion and what we are raised in. And yes, there have been times when religious sites have really promoted wildlife by being these pristine nature reserves. There have been other times when religion has built walls around their buildings, and that has led to differentiation of salamanders on different sides of these walls because they cannot scale these walls, and the walls have been there for 400 years. And so we see population differentiation happening because the animals cannot move back and forth.
Yeah, I detest fences. I'm always like, people are like, oh, let's put up a fence or blah, blah, blah. That'll solve the problem for things. I'm like, nobody's ever going to maintain the fence or remember to take that fence down in the future. Yeah, we see, I think some parks around me are often formerly military installations that are transferred and become parks. And all of a sudden, there's still like barbed wire fences and chain link around some of these places that really interferes with everybody moving around in the space. But yeah, I'm thinking of also big famous walls like the Great Wall of China or the demilitarized zone in Korea, between the Koreas, Gaza, Jerusalem is like Belfast, even like
The
the southern,
border,
yeah, the
yeah,
border, yeah, the
the
southern
US
border of the
border
United
wall.
States. Yep.
And it might depend on your size. Maybe if you're a small mouse, you can navigate through the small holes in the wall. But if you're something like a mountain lion, you're not going to be able to cross that. And so they're going to have different impacts on the different species, depending on how the walls are built, how the fences are built. And it's getting back into politics. The US has this very capitalistic mindset of this is mine. And it's interesting to travel to other places where there are no walls and people's backyards bleed into other people's backyards. All this space is public space. I was just in India and my friend was taking mangoes from a tree that were not on her property. And it was so shocking to me because I would never just walk up to somebody's tree and start picking their fruit. But it's not their fruit, it's a tree, it's public. And that is so against what I was raised with in capitalist America of this is mine, it's my property.
Yeah, and so many people have fruit trees where it just goes to waste if you don't grab it in time.
We don't plant fruit trees for a multitude of reasons or plant food that can be harvested and foraged. That's just not part of what we do. And so what it continues to flabbergast me about how we're designing and treating our city.
I do love it. There was some local legislation passed in Tacoma anyway, this earlier this year. I'm ostensibly part of Team Tree Tacoma, but there was some legislation passed where certain fruit trees are allowed in the right of ways, which is cool. So certain fruit trees that kind of behave themselves, I guess, are allowed. Honestly, Pacific Northwest is famous for apples, right? Often you go to the grocery store, look at the little sticker on it, and it says grown in Washington. Often those are grown on the other side of the mountains and watered from some big reclamation project. But having those fruit trees in your backyard really accessible in your neighborhoods, I think is super important.
Yeah. And as someone that lives in an apartment, that's not something that I have. I don't
Hmm.
have access to that where I can just go out and pick a lemon or pick some rosemary that was grown in the backyard. It is fascinating to me that people have these bushes and would be offended if I came over and picked some rosemary for my dinner. But
Mm.
I think part of it is relates back to that idea of this is mine, which I think stems from both religion and from politics in the United States.
Exactly. True. Before we leave, too, I also want to talk about armed conflict and war and how it reshapes cities physically and socially, and how those kind of ripple through animal behavior and gene flow. Because we often think military type activities leads to like pollution and lots of negatives for the environment, but in surprising ways, military activity, I think, has sometimes creates some sort of these little niches or habitat like tank created vernal pools, I think you all talked about in the paper, or I don't know, any other phenomena you could talk about.
Yeah. So war is a terrible thing, right? I think we can all agree that war is terrible. And our biggest concern is ensuring that human life is saved during wars. But wars have had some really weird consequences that we're only just recently starting to understand. Part of that is because during the active phases of war, we now have social media and people are posting pictures of wildlife that they're seeing during wars or seeing changes. There's a lot of devastating things that will happen to wildlife, right? Herbicide is a very common thing that happens during wars, and urban spaces are completely destroyed. We've seen that in places like Gaza and in the Ukraine right now. Both of those places, cities have just been completely destroyed. Post war or leading up to war, there's been some interesting things that have happened. Fairy shrimp are these weird invertebrates, and they can actually be carried on the treads of tanks. As the tanks are going along, they're creating these divots in the mud. That mud just fills up with water when it rains. And that's a perfect little vernal pool or habitat for these fairy shrimp. And as these tanks move, they're moving the fairy shrimp with them. We also have seen places like after the Korean War along the DMZ is heavily fortified. It's really not safe for humans with landmines and fences, but it's become this de facto wildlife sanctuary where Asiatic black bears are, where there's all this wildlife that's using that to traverse the landscape and between cities, things that they might not have been able to do if that hadn't been reclaimed by nature. And so war is incredibly complicated, and I don't think I will solve it in this podcast or in this paper. My goal is to get people to think about it. The authors of this paper, we span 5 continents, and many disciplines. And our goal is to get people thinking about the topics of religion, politics, and war in a different way and start to think about the impacts of these on wildlife in cities. When I was in Warsaw, Poland, that city is completely new, right? It was completely built after World War II. And so we think about these war zones that are happening right now, and we have the opportunity to build back the cities better. We need to think about what wildlife are there and how we can accommodate wildlife and people.
I love the peace building aspects of this. Just even though we're talking about war and incredibly, I think we on the podcast stands for anti-fascism and anti-war. I'm glad you brought up Gaza because I feel like I've been overwhelmingly silent on it. But this is a great time to talk about the negative aspects of militarization. I love how a great big handful of authors have organized across political boundaries and across space over the world to write this paper. It's a good motivating force for your discipline, but also changing this perspective on how we see evolution. And I guess people often think of evolution in terms of like ancient history or something that happens over long periods of time. So I think what I hear from you, or I read too, is that sometimes it can be fairly rapid.
So it depends on what the organism is, right?
Okay.
Humans are not evolving
Mm-hmm.
that quickly. We're very slow in our reproduction. We don't have many offspring at one
I'm
time.
trying as fast as I can.
But other organisms that have much more frequent offspring and large numbers of offspring, and when the selection forces are very strong, or the dividing factor, when we're talking about something like genetic drift, when that's very strong, that can happen very rapidly. I was trained that evolution occurred on the order of millennia, and it was very surprising to start to learn that evolution can happen within a human lifetime, that we can start to see differences in 70, 80, 90 years if we're talking about wildlife. And to me, that's exciting because it means that we can study things in our lifetime and potentially see some differences in our lifetime if we're really devoted to studying one organism, which I am not, as we can see, jumping between pigeons and squirrels. But it's flipped the way I think a lot of us have been thinking about evolution. And we can design these cities so that they're supporting these wildlife.
I hesitate to try to wrap this up in a neat bow. Like we're not going to solve everything over this podcast, you say. But I do appreciate that scientists and maybe like normal people have some role in confronting social histories embedded in the urban environments that we study and we live in. What role can community science or public storytelling play in shaping more just and biodiverse cities?
I think start looking at how your cities are designed and start noticing where there might be differences and why those differences might be. Is it hostile design? Are there parts of the city that are designed to prevent people from being there? And what impacts might that have on wildlife? I think about being in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and under one of the bridges, they were playing really terrible music. And it was so that people would not hang out underneath that bridge. But I'm assuming that's also putting off wildlife, right? If you're constantly playing music, the birds are not roosting under that. And maybe that's what they wanted in addition to not allowing people. But what does it mean when you're trying to prevent humans from using a resource to have that kind of downstream effect on wildlife? I like to say that we can't dictate who uses a resource when we put it out there. I get a lot of people asking me why squirrels are eating at their bird feeders. And I was like, oh, do you have a sign on it that says birds only? Like, you're putting out a resource. You can't dictate what wildlife are using that resource. So reframing how we're thinking about our wildlife and our urban spaces, I think is greatly important. And then getting involved. Are you voting? Are you talking to your city planners, your parks department about why you don't have certain resources in different parks? Why are there no low bushes in this park? What do we need to do to ensure that wildlife can be active in this area?
Yeah, sometimes I've walked out the back door. I'm so pissed when the rat is just like hanging out, like swinging on the bird feeder. And I know rats are like ubiquitous. They eat the apples too off the tree too. They're probably the ones I find chewing on the apples. The fruit
You,
trees we just talked about. We don't have enough fruit trees. I'm like the rats are eating is like rat food.
you're putting out a resource
Yeah.
and you're putting out a great resource. Why would they not use it?
Mm.
They would be, it would be wild for them not to access that resource.
Mm-hmm.
And why don't we just embrace the fact that squirrels
Yeah.
are using the bird feeders? And
Dude, my dad loves squirrels. So many people just feed squirrels, put the squirrel food out, like corn on the cob or peanuts. I was like, why do you have this? Like, they love squirrels. Anyway, hostile design, spiky things that don't allow people to lay down, take a nap, things like that. That's another part of landscape design.
in the Bay Area, there are many places where unhoused people used to pitch tents under the highways. And so they've gone in and put in boulders so that people cannot camp there anymore. And I think a
Right.
lot about that. Oh, boulders, that's going to be great for rats.
Yeah.
Like you're just
Yeah.
inviting the rats on in.
I'm a vegetation person too. I'm just like, yeah, it's a spot for weeds to grow, and then I'm like it's a boulder and a blackberry.
And so instead of dealing with the housing problem that is present, oh, here we're going to slap a Band-Aid on it, and actually it's going to influence the
Yeah.
wildlife.
Are you ready to transition to some rapid fire questions?
Yes.
Could you please finish this phrase? Restoration is blank.
Confusing. Confusing.
Yeah, that's a good one. All
What
right.
do you want me to go into that or just
Yeah,
that
no, explain yourself.
that ecosystems are changing constantly. And so I think a lot about what are we trying to restore it to and what does it mean to be restored? Because ecosystems will always be in flux.
Excellent. Yeah, we talk about shifting baselines a lot, what we're designing for and restoring to. You'll see it like tentacles of that or threads of that throughout the different episodes. What about is there a book or a podcast or art piece that shifted your thinking lately?
So I just finished Pathogenesis, A History of the World in 8 Plagues. And that was fantastic. It was right on with everything that I want to think about of how humans and their decisions are impacting everything. So highly recommend that book. I listened to it on audiobook free from my library. I'm very thankful for my library.
Nice. Love libraries. Lovely. What's your most useless superpower?
My most useless superpower is being able to identify roadkill at 70, 80 miles an hour.
Yeah.
It is not the superpower that I want, but I can see it. I can identify what species it is, and I can identify if it's worth turning around and picking it up.
I don't encourage you to drive 80 miles an hour. Be safe. Hope you're wearing a seatbelt.
There's a couple places in the Midwest with some fast highways.
Oh, yeah. You're like on the Autobahn and you're
Yeah.
like cruising. You're like, oh, yeah, that was a raccoon.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay. Do you have a favorite childhood cartoon?
The only cartoon that I can remember from my childhood is The Simpsons. We were a Simpsons family. And every Sunday night we watched The Simpsons, and the kids across the street were not allowed to watch it because they were the heathen kids that were allowed to watch that bad TV show.
Oh my gosh. We endorse The Simpsons here. That's lovely. A weirdest place you spotted urban wildlife? You just said the side of roads, but that's a common spot. Anywhere else?
It's a common spot. Yeah. Walking home from a bar at 2 a.m. in New York City and seeing pigeons out feeding and being like, it's 2 a.m. What are you doing out here?
Yeah.
Are you out here because we put our trash out at night in New York City? Are you out here because there's so much light pollution that you don't know that it's really nighttime? It just feels like dusk. Or are you out here because you're avoiding predators? Or is it some combination of all three? And I really liked being able to do my dissertation work while I was walking home from a bar.
I don't know if that was ended up in the text somehow. That's awesome.
It,
Late night pigeon party.
it shaped my thinking.
Creep around the streets or creep around parks late at night.
Be
See the
careful,
nighttime
but
behavior. Yeah.
it's fascinating to see what wildlife is doing in cities at night.
Do you have a favorite urban wildlife adaptation you've observed firsthand besides the late night?
So one of my favorite stories is Dr. Kristen Winchell, who is a professor at NYU, has studied lizards in Puerto Rico and shown that lizards in urban areas have longer limbs and stickier feet. In urban areas where the trees are further spaced apart and the trees are often acting as a refuge for these lizards, if they have longer legs, they can run, they can cover more distance in the same amount of steps and essentially run faster because their limbs are longer. And they have stickier feet because they're climbing on different substrates. You can imagine climbing on painted metal or glass is very different than climbing up the stem of a tree. And I was lucky enough to go to Puerto Rico multiple times and catch these lizards and test them. We were able to test how sticky their feet were and count how many lamellae, the specialized scales they have on their toes, and run them up lizard racetracks, like a lizard Grand Prix, and see how fast they ran at different angles and on different substrates.
And what's your favorite city for people watching?
I love New York City. I love it so much. It is what I think of as home. I loved being in Central Park with my best friends and being like, hey, are we going to meet at our spot? And we had our little spot that we would hang out at and people watch. But I think any city is great for people watching. I love snooping in on people's conversations and hope that they snoop in on mine.
Everyone talks loud there, right? There's so many of you.
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of wildlife in New York City that I think people don't think about. We have bats, we have flying squirrels, we have salamanders and snakes. We had a seal that had decided to camp out in the harbor right by my apartment.
Do you have a favorite song, maybe a kind of a wildlife appropriate song to add to the Tree Hugger mixtape?
Ooh, okay. Wildlife appropriate song only because of the name. Tusk by Fleetwood Mac. There's a drum line in that song that just makes my heart happy.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, I haven't promoted this mix very well, but it's out there on a certain mega music platforms for everyone to see. So I'll put it in the show notes. So we'll add Fleetwood Mac on there. Cool. Thank you so much for carving out some time in your day, and you're busy. Super good. I'm glad I finally was brave enough to reach out to you.
I'm not that scary, right?
No, you're super cool. You're great.
Hey, we're all just trying to get through life without pooping ourselves. And that can go on the podcast.
All right. Great. Yeah, we barely swore. You're very polite the entire time.
I just did NPR, so I have that NPR voice in my head right
we're
now.
like... Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us wherever you are and however you listen. I'd love to hear what you think about today's episode. What resonated with you? What questions did it stir up? Maybe you'll never look at a pigeon or a street corner the same way again. Let me know. You can find the archive of this and other episodes at treehuggerpod.com or reach out to me via email at treehuggerpod@gmail.com. You'll also find us on social media at treehuggerpod. This show is powered by curiosity, community, and a little bit of stubborn belief in our collective ability to repair what's been broken. It's also totally independent. If you believe in the value of these conversations and want to support the work, I'd be very grateful. You can chip in to help cover the small overhead of producing the show through PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App. Those links are in the show notes. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show on whatever podcast platform you use. That helps other folks find the show. And if there's someone in your life who might love this episode, send it their way. And remember, the edge between the built and the more than human isn't a hard line. It's a zone of possibility. It's in the stories we tell, the species and individuals we share space with, and the ways we adapt together. Thanks for hanging out. See you next time. And as always, see you in the woods. How'd the interview with St. Louis Public Radio go?
Good. I did not say fuck the entire time.
Oh.
It was my first live radio show.
Do you swear a lot? You can feel free to swear.
I can swear on your show.
I think fucking A.